This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we try to search for a semblance of order amidst our mad world. And part of the way that we search for that order is searching in the seemingly most unlikely of places. And one of those seemingly unlikely places is the world of high-stakes gambling. I think our guest today would concur with me, and the famous pollster Nate Silfer would also concur with me. Because if you read his book, On the Edge, he explains that the world of high-stakes gaming has quite a bit more order and fairness than many other domains in life. He looks at today's elites as being segmented into the river, by which he means the risk takers constantly trying to maximize equity and their expected value, even if it means risking more than they might be comfortable losing, and the village, by which he means the establishment liberal elites who think that they are guarding culture and civilization, but are afraid of offending anyone, and they want to play it safe, and they want to police speech, and they may in fact be allowing the enemies of civilization to thrive out of a fear of taking risks to block them. Now, of course, I think this sharp bifurcation is false. But that isn't to say that Nate Silver isn't getting at something, that we can't unpack something here. Gambling can teach us not only about risk-reward calculations, but about calculated and courageous risk-taking, about picking oneself up after a bad beat, but also about communities of trust and objectivity. Now I'm going to pause with that intro out of the way. Let me do a bit of housekeeping. So we're doing a two-part feature on gaming. We have our main episode today with Wilcox Snellings, and then released next Wednesday on the Substack, we are going to have a bonus episode which you can't get via your main podcast feed. So you can't get it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and that link is going to be in the show notes. It is a special bonus episode with former world champion of backgammon, Sander Liloff. Why are we putting it in the Substack only? Because it's racy content. He's charismatic. He has controversial audio on topics ranging from Ukraine and his opinion, which is that he would not want to fight to defend his country against Russia, then to topics like monarchy, where he thinks that some aspects of monarchy might be a better form than democracy. So if you're interested in this controversial but very engaging content, please subscribe to our free Substack, and then you're going to get it next Wednesday. Now, I am very honored to be joined by the former #1 giant of backgammon, Wilcox Snellings.
Jason, I really appreciate this opportunity. I have listened to almost every one of your podcasts and so impressed. I had no idea we'd get to this point where I would be a participant on one of the shows.
You're right. Mega orderers can transition from being diehard listeners to asking questions and helping shape content, or even appearing as guests. So you call Costa Rica home, Wilcox, but your family name carries with it a bit of Southern charm. And by accent, would it be correct to call you a New Yorker?
Well, I was born in Louisiana. Almost all my family are from that great and quite varied state and still live there. But when I was young, at age 4, I went with my mother up to New York City after a divorce, and we stayed with her mother for a while. And I really grew up in New York City, right there in the Upper East Side at various locations as we tried to figure out our best ultimate landing spot. But I still spent a couple of months every year throughout my childhood in Louisiana, and it certainly got a lot of experience and at times an accent from that part of the country. I got an interesting balance, let's put it that way.
Sounds the best of both worlds. And I think because New York and London can both be bubbles in a way, not only in how elite they are, but how concerns of people there are different than elsewhere. Good to have a little bit of both. How did you first encounter backgammon in the New York metro area and gaming?
Well, I learned backgammon from my stepfather's family. So I was about 15 or 16, played a little bit, loved the board layout, the combination of skill and luck with the dice playing a pretty significant role. And as far as New York went, then I discovered at some point one of the seedier backgammon establishments in New York on Broadway, but it still had some very talented players. The audience is unlikely to be familiar with backgammon names, but Paul McGreal is one of the seminal figures in backgammon and contributed just so much.
You could really say he's the godfather of our game. He took it from being a game that people played and didn't understand to being a game that had core concepts that could be used to unlock what was going on. He was like the Maimonides of backgammon.
Yeah, he was incredibly important. And he wrote a book simply called Backgammon, which was for many years was it. And I got to meet him playing at this divey establishment. And that's where, for very low stakes, you're not going to win at the beginning. You're always going to be up against hustlers for any stake. And so I didn't win at the beginning, but I was just devouring everything I could and watching the top players. And that's where I got my start.
I just want to paint a picture for the listeners who may not know about the fact that in the 1970s there was a moment of fashionability for backgammon. Why was backgammon cool in those days? I wasn't alive yet, but in a way that poker and chess were not cool. They have fads now, but it doesn't have the certain cooliosity that our game had, say, 45, 50 years ago.
Well, I think it showed up in Hollywood. It showed up in Beverly Hills. And so you had some celebrities playing it. It ended up migrating to the Playboy Mansion with Hefner and that scene. And James Bond, there were a couple of movies where it was featured. And it's also much different than poker in chess beyond sort of obvious ways. Chess tends to have people who are brilliant, perhaps in very narrow ways. And for regular people, yeah, you can figure out the rules of the game and play, but you feel kind of lost, like you're just shuffling pieces around rather than really understanding what's happening. And it's not that audience friendly. And in poker, by and large, there's a lot of hidden information there, not to mention the fact that poker back during those times, there was a lot of cheating and there was a lot of expectations that things were never completely on the up and up in poker circles. Backgammon, I'm not saying it never ended up having some scandals here and there, but by and large, it was quite different than poker in that regard. And also, you could see everything that was going on. It felt like a child could kind of learn how to play, not necessarily be particularly good, but it had the appeal of seeming to be relatively accessible.
Now, we were talking about this time when backgammon was cool, and it had some, for lack of a better term, sex appeal. That time briefly overlapped with the time that you were considered among the best or the best backgammon player in the world. So what I wanted to ask you, very few people can say that at any point in their lives they were truly the best in the world at the thing that they did. What was that like? How did it feel? What did it teach you about using a skill to make money and to meet people and to take risk?
What was interesting was I took up the game because, again, I love the aesthetics. I mean, the first girl that I seriously dated as a high school junior, I remember going to this one friend of mine his parents had a pretty posh place in Park Avenue, went to a party, and they had one of these beautifully inlaid table backgammon boards. And she said, "Oh, do you play?" And, I knew how to play. But we sat down and played, and she really knew how to play, better than me for sure. And watching her and took it to a slightly different level. We only lasted about 6 months, and backgammon obviously has lasted, 50-something years. My developing addiction for the game, I could see a window where I might be able to compete with the better players if I just stuck with it long enough. I was determined to do that. And I wasn't imagining, I'll end up being number one, because that's, in anything, I think you start smaller. And it was in college playing in my dorm with some pretty good players. And that's when I just started practicing and playing against whomever and just trying to learn the game. Years passed and I kept playing, and I was playing in clubs, and eventually I was going to tournaments a bit. And it was in the late 80s and through about 1991 in New York, where now I was extremely focused and I was getting to play with the top players in one or two of the New York clubs. And I would study their matches, figuring out what they were doing that I wasn't doing, pretty much assuming that if they were all doing something I wasn't, they were probably right. And it just kept chipping away in different ways to try to become really good.
Now to pivot, let's talk about risk management. You've had a career in a way in risk management. I want to draw on some things that I've learned from backgammon and that Sander Liloff references in the bonus episode on Substack, which is that you need to calculate in life whether you're ahead or behind, whether the thing you want to have happen is likely to happen or very unlikely to happen, in terms of the amount of risk that you want to put in. And this sounds intuitive, but I'm not sure that our political leaders do it. So that if we would look at powerful countries like Britain in the early and mid 20th century, or America in the late 20th century and early 21st century, when you're the hegemonic power, you don't want to have huge changes in the global system. You need to try to keep things the way that they are. But if you're an up-and-comer like China or Germany in the interwar period, you can take huge risks to try to get ahead. How have our leaders, be they tech leaders or political leaders, failed to understand the basic principles of risk management as it comes to climate change, AI, the West's role in the world? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the basic idea of risk management is to, first of all, estimate what your advantage is and whatever it is that you're doing. If you're a business, you want to make sure that your product is good enough to actually have a share in the marketplace. You want to figure out what are your risks in terms of possible legislation going against you, fresh competitors. Can you advance your product over time, or is it sort of like kind of has a built-in dead end that won't progress very much? And there's just so many factors that go into it, including like cheating. That's not simply like changing laws to fit your competitors' needs, but there's varying forms of cheating that'll get in the way. These are like volatility factors. And so you may have an idea of what your current advantage is, but things are moving so fast. I mean, they've always moved quickly. There's always been competition. All these factors have always been there. But more recently, the amount of time you have to figure out something new, to adapt or improve, is getting squeezed more and more, so that you need to be, more conservative. Obviously, you need to be willing to take risk. And if you're young and enterprising and have a ton of money behind you and have some great product, you may hit it really big in a short period of time, but you have to be prepared if you want to be in for the long haul to, again, be extremely adaptable. I think just one reference point that I saw, going back maybe 15 years ago or so, was that of the Fortune 500 companies, only about 15% of these companies do the companies resemble their original business plan. And this gives you a clue not only about business, but also about personal decisions in some ways.
No, that's of course true. I mean, what does General Electric make now? They're not making money primarily with light bulbs and phonographs. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes for an article about the mismanagerial class. And this is a critical view of all these MBAs who come and take over things like an aeronautics company or Boeing or whatever, and don't understand that you can't just make the same plane for the next 30 years. You know what I mean? That the success of the firm is not to make exactly that same car and extract greater and greater profit, but you need to be creating value. And creating value is about flexibility. And I think that risk management and gaming can teach us stuff there. Now, after the break, we're going to hear more about risk management and a little bit of geopolitics with today's guest, Wilcox Snellings.
The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim is a brand new podcast from Sky News. With me, Sky News' lead world news presenter, Yalda Hakim.
And me, Richard Engel, chief foreign correspondent for NBC News.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the front line of the world's trouble spots and asking the big questions to the world's most important and influential people.
Join us for the ground truth to help you understand what is happening in the world today and why it matters to you.
So that's The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim.
Listen every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Mega orderers. We've been hearing a lot about backgammon and ordering the disorder. I think you'd have fun playing a little bit of backgammon. Where would you enjoy playing it? On Backgammon Galaxy. It's where all the top grandmasters in the world play, and you can improve your game with its analysis mode. Backgammon Galaxy is the official app of the Backgammon World Championship, which Sander Liloff won. Wilcox came in third, and I came in second in the World Championship of Speed Gammon. It doesn't matter if you're a complete rookie and don't know the rules of backgammon, or you're a seasoned expert. Backgammon Galaxy is played at all levels, so please download the app in your app store or follow the link in the show notes. Backgammon Galaxy. Play amidst the stars. I think that the psychology of gambling and gamblers really is relevant when we look at Ukraine and Russia. I mean, in Slavic culture, chess is very highly valued as a training ground for war. And there is no doubt to me that I think Putin was bluffing when he, in January of 2022, massed all his troops at the Belarusian-Ukrainian and Russian-Ukrainian borders. He thought the West was going to fold. Then, when he went in and didn't succeed immediately, we didn't push our advantage thinking that he would go nuclear. But we could have called his bluff more. So there's been lots of bluffing going on here. Now, in the last couple of months, we haven't spoken about it much on the pod, but the Ukrainians, of course, have invaded Russia. This is what they call their Kursk offensive. And the Russians may or may not have seen it coming, but it caught a lot of people by surprise and has tipped the calculus. So again, looking at these 2 or 3 years of war, what are your takeaways?
Well, from the outset, this whole question of what was the percent chance that Putin was or would be bluffing with a nuclear threat, and what would the degree of nuclear threat be? A lot of these, have the probability, and then what is the impact of those particular outcomes? It's a very complicated formulation, and sometimes the people involved have their own particular axe to grind or perspective on Putin historically that may not be entirely accurate with where he is now, a little bit older, a little bit more desperate perhaps. Let's say he was bluffing 90% of the time. Are you willing to take that 10% risk that he's not bluffing? And the question of getting involved or not, and replaying whether we should have not pushed for Ukraine getting into NATO at this point until Putin fades or dies or has less power. It's incredibly complicated. I certainly don't know enough to give an answer. I felt at the time personally that we were justified in getting involved. And it was clearly not known again, if we got involved, not in terms of troops on the ground, but in terms of providing weaponry and financing, which we're still doing, would that be enough to bring everybody to the table in a way that Putin might not want, or at least forestall China going after Taiwan? There's so many moving parts to this that it's easy, as gamblers, as sophisticated gamblers, we try not to do what's called resulting. Resulting would be you make a decision as conscientiously as you can, and it works out or it doesn't work out. And particularly when it doesn't work out, there's an inclination in everybody, at least for a moment, to say, I made the wrong decision because it didn't work out. You're dealing with estimations of probabilities, and your estimations may be good, they may not be good. But in any event, there will be a result. And you may have made the optimal decision and not get a good result. And that happens in games as well as it does in warfare.
This is a critical lesson that I've learned from gambling to avoid resulting. And I fear that we're going to have a lot of resulting going on relative to people's votes in the US presidential election. How do I mean? I've been back in the States for about 2 weeks prior to us doing this interview, Wilcox, and I am having conversations with strangers about their political views. And I've been getting things from the Indian American Uber driver, from the Hispanic American lawn care professional. I didn't really like Trump, but things were better 4 years ago, and now things are very expensive. I might be willing to go back to the time of Trump. And then my response is, no, but 4 years ago, the world was in a better place economically, and things were less expensive because they were less expensive. It has had nothing to do with the changes in Bidenomics. But this inclination to resulting is so ingrained that when I'm chatting to people who are traditional Democratic voters, they may say things like, oh, well, but it wasn't so bad, less time. And how do you fight that? How do you help people understand that they can't just do resulting when they're making these super important political decisions?
Yeah, I think there's actually, unfortunately, sadly, there's very little remedy for that, considering the amount of information that people are, or so-called information that people are consuming, especially on social media at this point. It's just a truckload of, largely garbage on both sides. People are so connected to what just happened yesterday, usually not even important things, but to have any perspective over a period of years, that used to not be so difficult. But people are becoming, in a way, with all this pseudo information, much less nuanced, much less sophisticated than they used to be. This distinction between, like correlation versus causation. I mean, this is at this point, this is just for academics. I mean, because other people might not use that language, but at least they used to have some sense of what led to what, or what were the other factors involved at the same time. That appears to be much less the case at this point.
I don't think that people necessarily are infinitely better educated now, that they read ancient Greek and that their knowledge of Thucydides has improved or decreased in the last 15 years. But rather, 20 or 30 years ago, when I was in high school and college, we didn't think that you needed to have an answer to a question in 15 seconds and that you needed to learn the information from a 30-second video clip. And therefore, although people might not have had the technical vocabulary to differentiate between causation and correlation, there was still a deeper thought process about, is this a trend? And those things are just intuitive, even if you don't have the language. And I worry because part of neopopulism's rise is about convincing people that our problems are simple and they have simple answers. The migrants are coming and they are simply taking your jobs. The reason that housing is expensive is there are more migrants who have taken your housing. That is a thought process that can be jammed through given the information channels we have right now.
Right. It's the inflation of the supposed value of the micro at the expense of the macro vision. That's one way to look at it. Demagogues typically focus on a word, I don't know if it exists, but anyhow, it's instancism. We'll give you one instance of one horrific rape murder by an illegal immigrant in Texas. And we're going to show you the face of this sad, beautiful girl and her family. And yes, of course, everyone can relate to that. It's tragic. And it's sort of like the case of you can kill 10 people that are known in the community on the one hand, and you can kill 100,000 people by some despot in Russia 100 years ago. And somehow there's more affinity for these people whose faces you see than any kind of relation to the statistic of 100,000, because it's mind-blowing. You can't relate to it. And that's going on quite a bit. And I think it fits in with this, what you're saying about this attention, this very short attention. And not only that, everything gets inflamed. You not only have to, have read something that steers you to an opinion, you have to be dramatic about it. You have to be like, oh, for sure it's the case. Why is that the case? Oh, this guy that I trust on, some news network said it, and he's a smart guy. And whatever. It's very, very simplistic.
Yeah. The reason that I referenced Thucydides is that the very start of history has been about searching for causes and effects, not the random correlations. And I want us to try to think about cause and effect about income inequality. We've seen a huge rise in income inequality in our lifetimes. What are the causes and effects? How did we get to this place, Wilcox?
Well, we could retrace and figure out how that happened back in the 1920s. Also, there have been different periods, in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. And some is, taxation levels. It began certainly with the Reagan years, and think what you want of Reagan. And I think he was a plus minus in different areas. But certainly the kind of unbridling of Wall Street, the dramatic reduction in regulations, leading to greater monopolies and manipulation. And it created, just the movie Wall Street by itself, it was part of that time period where greed is good. And I think that is sustained in many ways over the decades since.
Sticking with income inequality, I'm the first to say that our taxpayer dollars are being misspent, both in the US and the UK. And we've spoken on other episodes about how it is a shambles that the NHS, is not delivering the best outcomes for the British population, and are maybe making it seem like governments can't use tax money to really benefit their populations, and that the private sector might have certain advantages over the public sector. But on the other hand, I wonder if this is because so much wealth is either offshored, or high income earners and big corporations have prevented government from getting their hand on the necessary tax revenues to make the green jobs, invent the solar panels, make a better health service. Do you think that there could be a game of poker going on between the big corporations who've turned into monopolies and the high income earners against the government? They're saying, if you tax us, we're going to move away. But it's actually a bluff, because if Keir Starmer taxes the city of London a little bit more, it's not like all the bankers are going to move to France.
Yeah, there's, of course, a lot of these corporations, extremely wealthy people, are kind of embedded with a certain important percentage of the politicians. So, between lobbyists and supporting campaigns and so on. But as part of the sort of the back end of what you were saying, I think in the U.S., again, I don't know what the numbers are, but there are people who clearly have a pretty good idea what these numbers are. And I'm pretty sure that you can increase taxes on the uber wealthy and the bigger corporations to a point just below the line where some of them really start to leave the country. So you don't have to go crazy and really obviously drive some of them away, at least for a while. But you can clearly, I think must be more than a little wiggle room in the high-end tax rates. I feel pretty confident. There are a lot of reports to that effect. And it's so much better for the country. The history, there have been many books, many sophisticated books and research papers created on what happens when a country is, in effect, suffering from a vast gap, this huge income inequality. And it never goes well. And this is not just currently, but, through history. Countries tend to ultimately fragment. Problems with earning potential from the country go down. There becomes social unrest and even potentially civil wars. I'm not projecting that in the U.S., but the downside for not trying to address this in the most obvious way, which is increasing the taxes on the wealthiest people and corporations, that risk is really great.
So both you and I have started Nate Silver's very interesting book, On the Edge. I haven't finished it. But what are your takeaways?
Yeah, one thing I was going to say is that in reading that and prior to reading that I really think that probabilities and statistics should be included, even in a very, very basic way, as early as second grade in any, whether it's public or private schools. Because the problem with it not being taught is that, and I'm not saying it's not taught at all in high schools and universities and whatever, especially as electives, but the world is more oriented toward understanding, maybe not in a highly sophisticated way, but the application and the ability to make, intelligent decisions about interest rates and where you're going to put your money. And it just so much of our lives revolve around having an understanding of what numbers mean. And I'm a big proponent of that.
Wilcox's first way to order the disorder is we should teach not only probability, but say basic home econ math in schools. I love it. You mentioned the Nate Silver book. We're going to put a link in the show notes to an article reviewing that book. And I'd like to read a quote from that New Yorker review, because the quote showcases how the study of gambling, games of chance, is actually at the core of economics, diplomacy, and of course, game theory. Now, I quote, "The mathematics of probability can be traced to a well-known stumper about how best to divide a pot, which a 17th century gambling enthusiast posed to two leading mathematical luminaries of the time, Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat. Their inquiry would spawn the powerful idea of expected value, the average outcome of an uncertain event calculated by multiplying the outcome in every possible state of the world by the chance of it happening. How powerful? This once alien notion that humans could be precise about uncertainty gave rise to the discipline of statistics, a model in which people were treated as rational actors trying to maximize the expected value of their utility became the cornerstone of modern economics. And systems based on feeding statistical prediction models with gargantuan helpings of data and computing power have already started to roil this century. Silver's book, therefore, falls into the long tradition of using games to model real-world decisions. John von Neumann, who some consider the greatest genius of the 20th century, was working at the Manhattan Project when he published, together with his frequent collaborator Oscar Morgenstern, a book titled Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, 1944. The work, which included a detailed chapter on poker and bluffing. That was the chapter that essentially gave birth to game theory, a field that neatly enough would provide the basis for the contemporary doctrine of nuclear deterrence. So decades before artificial neural networks could generate personalized poems and wacky images, computer scientists were already using them to build backgammon programs. That's what it says in the New Yorker. What do you think, Wilcox?
Yeah, I think the link is undeniable, and the breakthroughs that began in the 1700s and continue to this day, and the understanding how these things merged, and that one thing that didn't seem so important actually is vital in the understanding of very sophisticated and life and death models.
What is something that our leaders should take big risks to try to achieve?
Well, I certainly think that currently the notion that some people have that global warming is not an issue, or it's simply cyclical, is extremely disturbing. We have to get to a point of sanity where everyone agrees there's a problem. There are always going to be some disagreements on exactly what timeline there is or exactly what influences are the most significant, but we know there's a damn problem, and we have to be collectively serious about it, whether we're China or whether the US or we're Iran, wherever we are, we just have to get on the same page with that.
Awesome. Well, to end on a positive, hopeful note, it's been a real treat to talk with Wilcox Snellings today, one of the best backgammon players that has ever played the game. And I hope you've enjoyed today's program. If so, please join our Substack so that on next Wednesday, you can get that bonus episode with Sander Liloff, where we talk more about gambling and global order and Ukraine and democracy and, how does this all connect? And I think you're going to find that very fun. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer, George McDonough. It is never a gamble having him edit your podcast since it always comes out perfectly. Our executive producer has been Neil Fern. As always, I wish you an orderly week.